Shalom. My name is Ruchi Avital, and thank you for joining us on Tov, the Israel Jewish news station. Our guest today is Rabbi Pesach Wolicki of Israel365.com, and who has a podcast called Shoulder to Shoulder and writes a regular column in the Jerusalem Post. Shalom.
Good to be with you, Ruchi.
Thank you for joining us. I'd like to talk to you about Jewish identity. We're seeing a lot of unrest in Israel before the war. In the year before the war, there was the whole, all the demonstrations on Kaplan Street in Tel Aviv, thousands and thousands of people shouting and screaming against what they called the legal or lawfare revolution in Israel against the government. They think this government is the worst government ever. It's made up of the Likud party plus the National Religious Party and other religious parties, the Haredi parties. And there seems to be something going on in Israel. We've seen a lot of things happening since the beginning of the war. Could you reflect on that?
Sure. This is a great topic, Ruchi, and most people haven't stepped back and taken the 30,000-foot view and discussed it. So I commend you for getting into this issue. It seems like God was sending us a message with this war coming when it did. If you think back to all of the whole judicial reform and all of the protests and all of the division that was going on in the country, what we knew then, and we also know now, is that there was really a clash of two different worldviews. And it's really a clash of two different worldviews about what being Jewish is, what the state of Israel is, what Zionism is. And since the war started, one of the things that we've seen, and I'll come back to the judicial reform in a moment, but one of the things that we've seen very strongly is that support for the concept of a two-state solution has gone to almost nil. The Knesset passed a resolution with only the Arab parties opposing back in July, opposing any suggestions of a two-state solution. The reason I bring that up is that the whole question of what we're doing here in Israel, what is our connection to this land, what is our identity here, is really what underlies all of the tension that we've seen for the last few years in Israel, and it goes back to the origins of the Zionist movement. Today, the last time Israel had a truly left-wing prime minister is now decades ago. The Israeli population has become more politically conservative, more faithful to the Jewish faith, more right-wing over the course of the last generation. And that frightened the left and it frightened the secularists, whose view of Israel has always been that Israel is a refuge for the Jewish people, but is supposed to be a secular nation among all the other nations. And therefore, if we have to deny our connection to places like Hebron, where our forefathers and mothers are buried, and Beit El, where Yaakov had his dream of a ladder to heaven, and Bethlehem, and if we have to deny that this land is entirely ours, so be it, because that's not really essential. What's essential is that we have some sort of peace arrangement and that we can go to the cocktail parties in Europe and in Washington, D.C. and hold our heads up high as nice liberal Jews. And October 7th really blew that up and made a lot of whatever forces were at work for the last generation, moving Israelis more towards their traditional roots. The war, October 7th, and the war that followed has only accelerated this process. And what we're seeing is that Israelis are really rediscovering who we really are. And I think we're finally getting away from what can be called an exile mentality or a galut mentality, a Judaism that is always afraid and always apologetic and always looking for appeasement and acceptance from the world. And Israelis are more and more embracing the fact that we are independent and we need to stand up on our own, And along with that, that we must hold on to the entirety of the land of Israel for the Jewish people. So what's happened on the political level in terms of the two-state solution and what kind of accommodation we end up with the Arabs who live here is intimately tied in with the judicial reform, which was really the primal scream of a shrinking left-wing secularist elite that saw that the country was moving more towards a full Jewish identity and embracing Jewish values and taking it away from their secular hegemony. So if you put the two things together, they're really of a piece, Ruchi. And I think in the big picture, Israeli society is moving in a positive direction.
But we're still seeing some of these people demonstrating, far, far, far fewer than there were a year earlier. And we're even hearing them talking about the two-state solution, or two-state delusion, as I like to call it. How can we explain that? I mean, obviously, there isn't anyone to talk to on the other side, but I heard somebody interviewed today talking about letting the Palestinian Authority take over Gaza when the war is over. So how is that possible?
Well, there's always going to be that minority. And that minority, as you said, is shrinking. And unfortunately, we also live in an environment, and thanks to networks like Tov, this is less of an issue, but the mainstream media in Israel builds up and amplifies the voices of this shrinking left-wing minority. Just think about the fact that ostensibly the main left-wing party in this government, which is Yesh Atid, is now polling at under 10 seats if an election was held today. If you look at the totality of Jewish Israel, if you take out the Arab parties and you look at everyone else, and you look at how everyone else has voted and would vote in an upcoming election, we see that, as you say, these left-wing secularists are shrinking, but their voice is being amplified by the media, so it feels like there's still a significant force. But I think, again, if you pull back the camera and you look at where young people are, you look at where the polling is, you look at the spirit among those fighting this war and what and how they've inspired the rest of Israeli society, I think you really see that, again, in the short term, these people are still making noise. I can't explain why their delusion persists, except to say that if they dropped the delusion, all the dominoes would fall and they would be forced to come face to face with with the reality. So when you hear someone like Tony Blinken or Joe Biden or Kamala Harris calling for a two-state solution in the wake of October 7th, and you say to yourself, well, wait a second, why are they still thinking this way? They're of the same mindset as these secular elites in Israel. They can't get away from the fact that Israel should be a secular state that has acceptance by the nations of the world, rather than asserting our own Jewish identity in this land. And that's why Yehuda v'Shomron and the two-state solution issue is so central, because it's not just a particular policy prescription about how to get to some peaceful resolution. A while back, I was involved with I spent a lot of time with Christian leadership. That's what we do at Israel 365, and I've been involved in that for many years. And back in April, we had a big conference in Washington, D.C. of a couple hundred Christian pro-Israel leaders, and some senators and congressmen were there, all to come together and speak about the dangers of a two-state solution. And we did that because of the rhetoric coming out of the administration. And there was a reporter there from Reuters who came over to me, as I was one of the main organizers of this event, and he came over to me, and we held it at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. And he came over to me and he said, "Why are you so fixated on Judea and Samaria?" So I said, "Why am I so fixated on Judea and Samaria?" I said, "Let me make it simple. If the Jewish people do not have ancestral, historical, national rights to Hebron and to Beit Lechem and to Beit El, then we don't have rights to Tel Aviv or Haifa either." And that's really what this is all about. That's why all of these peace initiatives and Oslo and all of this stuff has failed, because the other side wants all of the land of Israel. So the delusion, the self-delusion, the intentional self-delusion, where regardless of what our enemies say, we say, no, 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 they really just want to live side by side, and if we appease them enough, they'll leave us alone, is all rooted in a lack of acceptance of the reality on the ground. And October 7th, thankfully, the silver lining of it is that it woke most Israelis up who were asleep, and it also woke up a lot of the Jewish world elsewhere in the world to the reality that we can no longer deceive ourselves. We can no longer pretend that, for example, that UNRWA is just a benign UN organization that we can work with. We can no longer pretend that the Palestinian Authority is a partner for peace. We can no longer, turn a blind eye to Jewish history and walk away from our ancestral homeland. A lot of these delusions that are sacred cows for the left-wing establishment were destroyed by October 7th and the war that has followed, and that in the end is a positive thing. Again, we're still going to have those holdouts. They have to hold out, because if they don't, there's a whole bunch of truths that they then have to accept that they're not ready for yet.
Well, we see vestiges of this in the controversy over the hostages. I don't think there's a real controversy because there's no deal actually in the making. But we see this when you talk to people on the left. They say we have to bring the hostages home at any price, at any price. And people, many of the hostage families themselves, parents and siblings of the hostages themselves and of those who are no longer with us and whose bodies are being held in Gaza, a lot of them disagree. A lot of them say we cannot give in to Hamas, even though, their own flesh and blood are being held in Gaza. They understand that there is no such thing as at any price. What does that mean even? But it's really interesting to see this argument as if there's an actual deal in the making, and all we have to do is say yes. We know for a fact, even Anthony Blinken himself has said that it was Hamas all along the way that refused a deal and not Israel, but that doesn't seem to change their minds in any way.
Yeah, look, let's set aside the point of whether or not there was actually a deal to be had. And let's ask the question that you've been asking, which is what's going on in the heads of these people in Israel who are saying we must make a deal at any cost, even if it means ending the war and leaving Hamas in power, leaving Hezbollah intact, etc. And it's easy to dismiss them derisively and say, oh, they don't care about the security of Israel. But again, this all goes back to the delusions that make up what I call two-state solution thinking, the two-state solution mindset, and the delusions that it's built on. The reason that they can sleep at night saying we want to make a deal, bring the hostages home, and end the war, even if it means that Hamas remains in power, even if it means that Hezbollah remains intact, the reason they can do that is because they hold fast to the delusion that our enemies can be appeased, and that international bodies and arrangements that are made and resolutions that are brought by and UN security forces and things like 1701, which was never adhered to in South Lebanon, which was meant to keep Hezbollah away from the border, or the Palestinian Authority as a worthy partner for peace. All of these delusions are all really built on the same mindset. So they honestly believe that we could end the war, come to some sort of accommodation, bring the Americans and the UN involved, and everything will be just fine. They have not learned the lesson of October 7th, and that's why they're willing to do this. It's all coming back to the same place. And again, if they accept that this entire way of thinking is a fantasy, the dominoes all fall and they will end up in the same place that the rest of us are, and they're simply not willing to go there.
So they actually refuse to believe it rather than don't believe it. They just won't allow themselves.
That's my only explanation. Otherwise, we'd have to say that they're a conscious fifth column who don't care about the security of Israel, and I don't believe that's true. I think that they honestly still believe that we can have our security with an accommodation with people who are hell-bent on destroying us.
So it's really, you have to ask yourself why they are so opposed to Netanyahu, who is actually, I think most people would agree, is doing a fantastic job in this war. He made mistakes before October 7th as well, but unlike many others, he realized that he couldn't continue in that direction anymore. But his opponents on the left, something like the Trump derangement syndrome, we have the Bibi derangement syndrome here in Israel, he's become the Antichrist, forgive me. He's the demon, he's the epitome of everything that is evil. They literally have said that he wants the hostages to die. That's how extreme they are.
They view him as standing in the way of their agenda, and this is also a delusion. You know, back in what was it? Back in April, when Senator Chuck Schumer took to the Senate floor and called for new elections in Israel to remove Netanyahu, or called on Netanyahu to oust ministers Ben Gvir and Smotrich from his coalition, which was ridiculous to hear a senator in the well of the Senate call for elections in a different country. It was crazy. But when you think about that and you play it out and say, okay, let's say there were new elections, does he really think that a left-wing government would be elected in Israel? If you do the math, I don't believe it's actually possible. I think the polling bears that out. It's a misreading of where the Israeli public are. Their hatred of Netanyahu, similar to the Trump derangement syndrome, you know, Donald Trump is fond of saying, it's not me they're after, you know, to his crowds. He'll say, it's not me they're after, it's you they're after, I'm in the way. Prime Minister Netanyahu, even more so since this war began, represents the death of their paradigm. They look at his government and they see religious people, they see political conservatives, they see nationalists, they see the growth of a Zionism that is not their old secular left Zionism. And therefore, they see him and everything that his whole coalition represents as a danger to their worldview and their identity, their dying identity, as left-wing secular Zionist Israelis. And so I think that's where that hatred for Netanyahu comes from. But let's call a spade a spade. Prime Minister Netanyahu also played along with the two-state solution ideas and negotiations and played along with these things for years. But he himself has also changed since October 7th and recognizes that strategically we need to change the Middle East. And, you know, one of the funny things is that the left has been attacking Prime Minister Netanyahu since the beginning of the war. And one of their constant refrains is, there's no strategy. You know, in Hebrew, like maha estrategia, there's no long-term strategy, as though Prime Minister Netanyahu is supposed to get up and announce to the world so all our enemies could hear what the strategy is. But it's not just that we don't know. Now, with a year's worth of war behind us, we could take a look at what's happened, and the strategy is actually quite clear. First, hold things off in the north long enough that we can destroy Hamas to the point of no return in the south. We still have to clean up the mess, but we've done a great job there. And then turn our attention to Lebanon and deal with them. And meanwhile, you know, dealing with Iran a little bit. And then it seems to me that once we get Hezbollah to the point where they're no longer a threat, I believe that he's going to then deal with the other threats around us as well. It seems the strategy is very clear and is taking shape. He wants to change the status quo. They're terrified of the change of the status quo.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Pesach Woliki, for that excellent summary of the situation here in Israel. And thank you to our audience. Don't forget to support and like us on all our different channels, YouTube, Instagram, and so on. Shalom.